So I really like studying the Odyssey this time, and I haven't really studied it in detail since maybe middle school, so I did a play off of that. And I guess I'll read the summary. My story is based on the classic Greek myth called Titanomachy. Titanomachy describes a war between the Olympian gods and the Titans, who were overthrown by the gods and cast into the deep dungeon Tartarus. Winston Churchill said that history is written by the victors. With this in mind, I question what the real story might have been if it were told from the Titan perspective. After all, the stories told from the perspective of the Olympian gods as good guys often seem filled with holes, contradictions, and behavior from the gods that seem distinctly selfish, malicious, and vengeful rather than godlike. These Olympian gods are the antagonists of my story, particularly Poseidon, because through deception and treachery, namely Pandora's box and the exploitation of Prometheus' weakness, they destroy the two great Titan cities, Atlantis and Olympus. My story is told from the perspective of a Titan named Vivian, who may be more recognizable by her two other roles, including Calypso from the Odyssey and Lady of the Lake from the Arthurian legends, myths which I have linked together. Her father, Atlas, is the Atlas who inspired the image of a Titan who is punished with the role of holding the world on top of his shoulders. I combined him with a parallel myth about another Atlas who is the king of the mythical city Atlantis that mysteriously sunk into the ocean. So I divided it up into three stories, or three basic parts, and then I focused on the first one to write my actual story. But the first book, Titanomachy, is it's several sections on how the daemons, which is what I call the Titans, so it's spelled D-A-E-M-O-N, so programming, that's like a program that works in the background, were skipped in order to show the contrast of Vivian's transformation from the Titan princess to Calypso, the character from the Odyssey. So my story begins with an orphan servant boy named Mark, who is actually Merlin before he becomes a magician, runs away from his castle and encounters a woman-like creature that lives in a lake in the middle of a remote forest. She begins to recount her story to him, and this is the perspective in which the majority of the story is told. So it's kind of like a retelling flashback, like Interview with a Vampire, sort of. Vivian foreshadows her history as the patroness of Romulus and Remus, represented in myth as the she-wolf who raised them, though she explains that things happen quite differently than the symbolic way the common myth explains the origin of Rome. She introduces herself as the former heir apparent of Atlantis before it was destroyed. After Atlantis was destroyed, the Olympian gods, called daemons, Vivian is exiled to a remote island and adopts the identity of desperate Calypso. To overcome her physical hunger, Titan hunger, for nectar and ambrosia from the Tree of Life, which is destroyed by the plagues from Pandora's box, Calypso stumbles upon the fact that ingesting human blood sustains her. However, she discovers that her despair at her helplessness and guilt for her grisly habit causes her to become predisposed to bouts of rage, violence, and provocative behavior. She stops trying to be good and lets herself become obsessed with the idea of revenge on Poseidon. She is pitiful because, though she ultimately desires love, she is heartbroken at the fact that Poseidon does not only love her but doesn't hate her either. His apathy enrages her ego, and so she seeks revenge on him to force him to notice her and make him feel something for her, even if it's only hate. She focuses her energy into developing a plan to destroy the daemons, currently the reigning power over the known world, and getting particular revenge on Poseidon. To do this, she rids herself of her self-pity and instead adopts a policy of patience. She postpones expressing her passions in favor of saving them as cold, calculating anger. To the daemons, she claims that she has changed. She supports them, charms them, and convinces them that she no longer bears malice for them or blames them for their destruction of Atlantis. Trying to infiltrate their trust the same way the daemons had infiltrated the trust of the Titans, Vivian ascends to a position of influence within the inner circle of daemons. She founds a brutal city named Sparthinia in a location that we now recognize as the birthplace of ancient Rome. Sparthinia is a self-consuming city whose ultimate goal is to let iron sharpen iron, discover diamonds of intellect and strength in order to train them and discard all those who do not measure up. It's an unforgiving city, and Vivian soon finds herself exhausted with trying to guard herself from her closest advisors, who, by extension of her philosophy, should make a constant effort to usurp her in order to let the greatest strength rule. Vivian uses her talents for persuasion to convince Poseidon and Hera to begin a mutiny against Zeus. Their combined efforts leave Zeus dead, but acquisition of his forces leads to disagreements about ownership of these between Poseidon and Hera, as Vivian hoped. In consorting with both Poseidon and Hera separately, she is able to make both paranoid that the other is planning an assassination. The two engage in war, and Hera is defeated. Part of this defeat is due to Vivian, who manages to slowly drain Hera's forces by bribing the commanders away from the battle and into her own safekeeping. Before Poseidon has a chance to gloat over his victory, Vivian attacks and destroys him through much difficulty and an attempt to spare his life, after which he betrays her and she is forced to kill him. And then book 2, which I actually found more interesting, although I focused on the first one, is told from the perspective of Remus. So as a way to reconcile her desire for love, mercy, and her love of self-reliance, Vivian raises and trains Romulus and Remus to be her adopted sons to respect her for her ability but protect her out of love. Romulus and Remus helped her defeat the Daemons, and now, after they are destroyed, she has no use for the city. Instead, she wants to retire the exhausting position of leadership. She promises to give the city of Sparthinia to the brothers to share, but after it is given, they argue. After seeing how selfish rulers always seem to be usurped eventually, Vivian desperately wants Romulus and Remus to be united and work together to build the city into one of the people. She wants the city to become one where mercy is valued and the weak are rejected, or respected. So that's kind of her character arc. But at first, the brothers work together. But when they both fall in love with the same woman, Nikita, she chooses Remus, Romulus erupts into violence. They argue in the language of her previous self-reliant philosophy, and eventually they decide that there can only be one ruler. They fight, and the costs are high to both sides. Through the rising cost of human life, including the life of Remus's beloved at the hands of jealous Romulus, Vivian persuades Remus to refrain from pouring out the blood of his armies. Failing to convince Romulus to engage him on a face-to-face duel, Remus goes on the run. Romulus hunts Remus down until Remus is left with no better option than to fake his own death. Believing Remus is dead, Romulus declares himself emperor of the city. He rewrites his own history, declares himself a god, renames the city Rome, uses the Atlantean language and customs as inspiration for the Roman way, but also combines these with customs from the nearby prominent human civilization, the ancient Greeks. Romulus ceases to respect Vivian, thinking himself too powerful and tough for her wisdom. He becomes vain, arrogant, and no longer recognizes Vivian as someone he knows. Using the city's resources, he expands his empire, though he does use one piece of her advice. Instead of killing his enemies, he absorbs the conquered people as slaves who have the chance to work their way up to equal citizens within the empire. Gradually, all knowledge of Vivian, the Titans, the Daemons, and Atlantis pass out of history in favor of remembering Caesar's conquests. After 40 years of his proud, cruel rule, his people begin to grow tired of him too. A hurricane comes to the land, and in the midst of the storm, 2 of his senators corner and stab him. He fights them off, but not without first receiving a fatal wound. Remus and Vivian find him after the storm on the edge of death. They are very afraid for him and try to get him to recognize his own weaknesses and repent, but he will not have it. He dies cursing them and God, and Vivian is terrified to realize that the boy she loved is completely replaced by wickedness, and there is nothing left of him to love. As a senator under a different name, Remus assists the city's peaceful transition to a new emperor. He quietly guides Rome for many years before he dies of old age. The last segment of the story, Chansonnière, is told from the perspective of Merlin. After Remus's death, Vivian leaves Rome and goes to the north. She becomes a hermit, living in a lake and surviving off the blood of murderers who wait in the woods to rob the innocent. At this time, the perspective of the story returns to recognize that Vivian has been telling this entire tale to Mark, young Merlin, and he assumes the role of the protagonist. Vivian feels sorry for Mark. She changes his name to Merlin and gives him a few gold coins, relics from Rome, to take into town and establish himself with a household. Over several years, she trains him with many aspects of Atlantean science that seem like magic to medieval Europe. Merlin, as a young man, thinks he has fallen in love with Vivian, but Vivian discourages this affection. Merlin goes out into the world for a few years to make his fortune, but upon returning to visit Vivian, she requests a favor of him. In the years when Merlin was out in the world, Vivian takes another orphan boy as her adopted son. Though she does not teach him any of her history or the ancient science, she plans to keep magic a secret from him so he may grow up to be a knight. This boy is called Lancelot, and he has been kidnapped by an evil sorceress named Elisina, who is Aphrodite, who was never destroyed and has renamed herself. This book delves into the differentiation between spells, actions of love, and genuine love. Alcina keeps an iron castle filled with bewitched lords and ladies. The castle is filled with illusions of prisoners and prisoners' loved ones. Merlin must navigate through this labyrinth in order to rescue Lancelot. Unknown to Vivian and Merlin, Lancelot takes a magical souvenir with him that will later be an instrument that instigates his affair with Guinevere. Merlin, initially jealous of Lancelot, becomes fond of him because he is only a child and looks up to Merlin. Lancelot is returned to Vivian's safekeeping until he grows up. Meanwhile, Merlin seeks out the future King Arthur to train him. When both King Arthur and Lancelot come of age, the two are brought together under Merlin's guidance. Throughout the course of his life, Merlin returns to Vivian for platonic confidence to seek guidance from her when he tries to help King Arthur develop a society that is based on the ideals of mercy and respect for the weak. Inspired by her ideals, Merlin encourages King Arthur to develop a culture of chivalry and selfless heroism. At one point, Merlin directs King Arthur to visit Vivian so he may acquire the sword Excalibur, designed by Vivian herself using an advanced metal alloy originally developed in Atlantis. When Merlin becomes old, Vivian uses her knowledge of Atlantean medicine to reverse the effects of age on Merlin. Consequently, the legend of his aging backwards arises. But there are limits to this science, and eventually Merlin decides to finish the natural aging process and dies. After Merlin's death, Vivian goes to sleep at the bottom of her lake, awaiting the time when she will reawaken. So I tried to blend a lot of the myths together, so a lot of the names I used, and especially like there was supposed to be a relationship between the Lady of the Lake and Merlin, and I just tried to blend them all together.